How did everyone find out about that? I asked, forcing a smile while my heart sank into my chest. The room went quiet for half a second. Not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for me. Long enough to see Olivia's face freeze before she reached for her glass of iced tea and looked away. The secret she had just repeated was one I had shared with only one person. Her. I sat at the far end of my granddaughter's birthday table, surrounded by family, laughter, paper decorations, and the smell of barbecue drifting in from the backyard. To everyone else, it was a perfect Saturday afternoon. To me, it was the moment something inside me shifted. My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm 72 years old, a widow, a mother, and until that afternoon, I believed trust was something that grew stronger with time. I believed family secrets stayed inside the family. Most of all, I believed Olivia, my daughter-in-law, cared about me. The conversation moved on quickly. Someone joked about football season. Someone else asked for another slice of cake. The children raced across the lawn with balloons tied to their wrists. Nobody seemed to notice what had just happened. Nobody except me. The secret Olivia mentioned wasn't dramatic. It wasn't scandalous. It was simply personal. Years ago, after my husband passed away, I had made a financial mistake that nearly cost me the house. I had told Olivia during one of our long afternoon conversations over coffee. I remembered the exact day. Rain tapping against the kitchen window. A half-finished crossword puzzle between us. She had reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and promised that whatever I shared would stay between us. Yet somehow, 3 relatives at that table suddenly knew details they should never have known. I smiled politely and took a sip of lemonade. The cold glass felt steady in my hand. That was important. At my age, people expect tears. They expect outrage. They expect emotional speeches. What they never expect is silence. Silence gives you time to think. Silence lets you see things clearly. As the afternoon continued, I began noticing details I might have missed before. Olivia seemed unusually interested in every conversation. She listened carefully whenever someone mentioned money, property, inheritance, or family disagreements. She laughed at all the right moments. She offered to help clean up. She looked exactly like the caring daughter-in-law everyone adored. But for the first time, I found myself wondering whether I truly knew her at all. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the sun disappeared behind the Colorado mountains, I sat alone on my front porch. The neighborhood was quiet except for the distant sound of sprinklers running across freshly cut lawns. I thought about my husband. He always said that trust was like fine china. Once cracked, it never looked quite the same again. I stared into the darkness and replayed every conversation I had shared with Olivia over the past 3 years. The memories came back one by one. The questions she asked. The details she remembered. The stories I told because I thought she cared. By the time the porch light flickered on above me, I had reached one painful conclusion. Secrets do not walk away on their own. Someone carries them. Someone chooses where they go. And for the first time, I began to suspect that the woman I had treated like a daughter might be carrying far more than my trust. But that wasn't even the worst part. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Sleep had come in short pieces, never staying long enough to quiet my thoughts. The house felt still. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked each passing minute, and the coffee maker hummed softly in the kitchen. It was the same routine I had followed for years, yet something felt different now. I carried my mug to the breakfast nook and looked out at the backyard. The maple tree my husband planted 20 years ago swayed gently in the morning breeze. He used to sit across from me every morning, reading the newspaper while I worked on crossword puzzles. After he passed away, the chair stayed empty. For a long time, I thought nobody noticed that emptiness except me. Then Olivia came along. When Daniel married her 6 years earlier, I had been relieved. She seemed thoughtful, patient. She remembered birthdays. She sent handwritten thank you cards. She always asked how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. After my husband died, she began stopping by every Thursday afternoon. Sometimes she brought muffins from the bakery downtown. Sometimes she arrived with nothing but a warm smile and 2 hours to spare. At least that was what I believed. Those afternoons became something I looked forward to. We would sit at my kitchen table and talk while sunlight filled the room. Daniel was often busy with work, and my grandchildren had their own schedules. Olivia listened when nobody else seemed to have time. Little by little, I started sharing pieces of myself. Not because she asked directly, but because she made it feel safe. I told her about the years when Daniel was young and money was tight. I told her how my husband and I nearly lost everything during a difficult recession decades earlier. I shared stories I had never written down and rarely discussed. Things that belonged to family history. Things I believed would remain between us. Looking back, I can see details I missed. Olivia remembered every conversation with remarkable precision. Months later, she could repeat exact dates, names, and figures from stories I barely remembered telling. At the time, I considered it a sign that she cared. Now I wonder if it was something else. One afternoon, she asked about old family disagreements. Another time, she wanted to know why a certain relative stopped attending holiday dinners years ago. The questions always sounded harmless, casual, wrapped inside ordinary conversation. I never felt pressured. In fact, I often felt grateful that someone was interested. That gratitude blinded me. Around noon, my phone rang. It was my sister, Carol. We exchanged small talk for a few minutes before she hesitated. Her voice changed slightly. Then she asked whether I was really planning to sell a piece of property my husband had left me. My stomach tightened immediately. I had never mentioned such a thing to anyone. Not because it was secret, because it was not true. I laughed politely and told her she must have heard a rumor. After we hung up, I sat quietly at the table. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. This was the second strange conversation in less than a week. The second time someone seemed to know something connected to me that should not have been circulating through the family. I looked at the empty chair across from mine and thought about every Thursday afternoon Olivia had spent in this kitchen. For the first time, I stopped asking whether information was leaking. Instead, I started asking who benefited when it did. For the next several days, I paid closer attention than I ever had before. Not to what people said, but to how information moved. Families have their own invisible currents. A comment made in one kitchen somehow appears at another dinner table 3 days later. A casual remark becomes a certainty. A private concern becomes public knowledge. I had seen it happen all my life, but now I was watching with different eyes. The following Sunday, Daniel and Olivia invited me over for dinner. Their house sat on a quiet street lined with oak trees and neatly trimmed lawns. The grandchildren were playing in the family room when I arrived. The smell of baked chicken filled the kitchen. Everything looked normal, comfortable, familiar. Yet I could not shake the feeling that something beneath the surface had changed. During dinner, Olivia was her usual cheerful self. She asked about my garden. She complimented the lemon pie I had brought. She laughed at Daniel's stories from work. Anyone watching would have seen a devoted wife and loving daughter-in-law. I almost felt guilty for doubting her. Almost. Then something happened. Daniel casually mentioned a conversation he had recently had with a cousin in Arizona. According to the cousin, I was considering downsizing my home and moving into a retirement community. My fork stopped halfway to my plate. I had never discussed such a plan with anyone. Not Daniel. Not my sister. Not even my closest friend. I smiled and gently corrected him. Daniel looked surprised. Olivia looked down at her plate for a moment before taking a sip of water. It lasted only a second, but I noticed it. The conversation continued, yet my mind stayed fixed on that tiny reaction. On the drive home, I replayed every detail. The cousin had no reason to invent such a story, which meant somebody had told him. The question was who. That night, I pulled an old notebook from a desk drawer and began writing things down. Dates, conversations, rumors, questions. Nothing dramatic, just observations. The kind of notes a person makes when they are trying to understand a pattern. As the pages filled, something uncomfortable emerged. Many of the rumors seemed connected to information I had shared during private conversations over the years. Not exact copies, more like distorted reflections. A detail added here, a fact exaggerated there. Enough truth to sound believable. Enough changes to create confusion. One afternoon, while organizing old photographs, I came across a picture from 5 years earlier. It showed Olivia and me sitting together at a church fundraiser. We were both smiling. Looking at that photograph stirred memories I had nearly forgotten. Back then, she often asked thoughtful questions about family relationships. She seemed especially interested in understanding old disagreements and complicated histories. I remembered feeling touched by her concern. She wanted to know everyone. Or so I thought. The more I reflected, the more those conversations seemed different. Less like curiosity, more like collection. That realization stayed with me all evening. A week later, another unexpected phone call arrived. This time it was a distant relative from New Mexico. She mentioned hearing that I was unhappy with Daniel and worried about how family assets would eventually be divided. The words landed heavily in my chest. Not because they were offensive, because they were entirely false. After we hung up, I sat silently in my living room as late afternoon sunlight stretched across the carpet. 2 rumors could be coincidence. 3 began to feel intentional. I looked at the notebook resting on the coffee table. Then I opened it and added another entry. For the first time, I was no longer asking whether someone was spreading stories. I was beginning to wonder whether those stories served a purpose. Once I started looking for patterns, I found them everywhere. Not dramatic patterns. Not the kind that announced themselves with obvious signs. These were quieter, more subtle, the kind that only become visible when you stop making excuses for people. Over the next 2 weeks, I continued living my life exactly as before. I attended church on Sunday. I met friends for coffee on Wednesday mornings. I watered my flowers every evening before sunset. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Internally, I was paying attention. One afternoon, Olivia stopped by unexpectedly. She carried a box of blueberry muffins from my favorite bakery and greeted me with the same warm smile she had worn for years. We sat at the kitchen table, just as we always had. The conversation drifted from family news to neighborhood gossip and eventually toward finances. That alone was not unusual. What caught my attention was how naturally she guided the discussion. She never asked direct questions. Instead, she created openings. Little spaces inside conversations where information could be offered voluntarily. It was a skill I had never noticed before. Or perhaps I had noticed it and mistaken it for kindness. As we talked, she casually mentioned that several families she knew were updating their estate plans. Then she laughed and said everyone worried too much about paperwork. The comment sounded harmless. Yet I found myself remembering other conversations from previous years. Different topics. Same pattern. A gentle question. A reassuring smile. Then another question. By the time people realized how much they had shared, they felt as though they had simply been having a pleasant conversation. After she left, I sat alone in the quiet kitchen and opened my notebook again. I wrote down everything I could remember from the afternoon. The more I documented, the clearer things became. Olivia rarely volunteered personal information about herself. Instead, she encouraged other people to talk. She listened carefully. She remembered details. Then somehow those details seemed to appear elsewhere months later. Sometimes changed slightly. Sometimes wrapped inside rumors. But always connected to someone else's private life. A few days later, I attended a charity luncheon at the community center. During dessert, an acquaintance leaned toward me and lowered her voice. She asked whether Daniel was planning to take over management of certain family investments. I nearly dropped my fork. That conversation had originated months earlier during a private discussion between Daniel, myself, and Olivia. No one else had been present. Yet somehow strangers were discussing it over cheesecake and coffee. I smiled politely and changed the subject. Inside, however, another piece of the puzzle slid into place. That evening, I pulled an old photo album from a shelf in my living room. I was searching for something specific. Pictures often reveal details memory overlooks. As I turned pages, I found photographs from family holidays, graduations, birthdays, and summer barbecues. Olivia appeared in nearly all of them. Always smiling. Always positioned near whoever held the center of attention. I studied those images longer than I intended. Not because they proved anything. Because they reminded me how completely I had trusted her. That realization hurt more than any rumor. Trust is not lost in a single moment. It fades one discovery at a time. By the end of that week, I no longer believed information was spreading accidentally. Someone was carrying it. Someone was benefiting from it. And for the first time, I stopped focusing on what Olivia had shared. Instead, I began asking a far more important question. Why was she sharing it at all? The answer arrived when I least expected it. It was a Thursday afternoon, warm for early spring, and I had just returned from the grocery store. I was putting away a carton of eggs when my phone rang. The caller ID showed the name of my granddaughter, Emily. She was 24 years old, recently married, and one of the few people in the family who still spoke her mind. Her voice sounded hesitant when I answered. She asked if I had a few minutes to talk. Something in her tone made me sit down immediately. We spoke about ordinary things at first. Her new job, her apartment, weekend plans. Then there was a pause. A long one. Finally, She asked a question that caught me completely off guard. She wanted to know whether I had really been saying negative things about several members of the family. For a moment, I could not even respond. Then she explained. Over the previous year, she had heard comments repeated at gatherings and family events. Comments supposedly coming from me. Remarks suggesting I was disappointed in certain relatives, concerned about how some people handled money, critical of decisions I had never criticized. Emily admitted she had never fully believed the stories, but she had heard them often enough to become confused. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not anger, not shock, clarity. I carefully asked where she had heard those things. Another pause followed. Then she quietly said Olivia's name. According to Emily, many of the stories had surfaced during casual conversations, never presented as gossip, never delivered with obvious malice. Instead, Olivia often framed them as concern. She would lower her voice and say she worried about family tensions. Then she would repeat something private, something personal, something that made me appear judgmental or unhappy. By the end of the conversation, people often walked away believing they understood my thoughts better than I did myself. After we hung up, I remained seated at the kitchen table for a long time. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background. Everything around me felt ordinary, yet nothing was ordinary anymore. Emily had unknowingly provided the first direct confirmation I had received. Not proof, but confirmation. More importantly, she had revealed something I had not fully understood before. The rumors were not random. They all moved in the same direction. They weakened trust. They created distance. They made me seem difficult, critical, or unreliable. And each time that happened, someone else appeared more reasonable by comparison. Someone else appeared more informed, more trusted, more influential. I opened my notebook and reviewed months of observations. Dates, conversations, questions, rumors, patterns. Suddenly, the pieces aligned in a way they never had before. Information was not merely escaping. It was being shaped, adjusted, redirected. The realization was unsettling because it suggested intention. That evening, I received a text message from Olivia asking whether I wanted to meet for coffee the following week. The message looked perfectly normal, friendly, warm, the kind of note she had sent dozens of times before. I stared at it for several seconds before replying yes. Then I set the phone down and looked toward the family photographs displayed across my living room shelf. Trust had carried me to this point. Trust had also blinded me. But now something had changed. For the first time since this began, I was no longer waiting for answers to appear on their own. I had enough information to stop reacting. It was time to start testing what I suspected. The following Tuesday, I met Olivia at a small coffee shop near the town square. It was the same place we had visited dozens of times before. The scent of roasted coffee beans filled the air, and soft music played through overhead speakers. Nothing about the setting felt unusual, which was exactly why I chose it. Familiar places make people comfortable. Comfortable people rarely guard their reactions. Olivia arrived wearing a light blue sweater and carrying her usual oversized handbag. She greeted me warmly and asked about my week. I smiled and answered as naturally as I could. For the first 20 minutes, we discussed ordinary things. The weather, the grandchildren, a new restaurant opening across town. Then I carefully guided the conversation in a different direction. I mentioned that I had recently met with an attorney. The statement was true. Several months earlier, I had updated routine paperwork after my husband passed away. Olivia immediately became attentive. Not suspicious. Interested. There was a difference. She asked whether everything was all right. I assured her it was. Then I lowered my voice slightly and shared something that did not exist. I told her I was considering making a significant change to my estate plan. According to the story I invented, I was thinking about leaving a valuable parcel of land to a charitable foundation rather than keeping it within the family. I spoke casually, as though I had not fully made up my mind. Then I added one important detail. I told her I had not discussed the idea with anyone else and preferred to keep it private until I reached a final decision. Olivia nodded immediately. She even placed a hand over her heart and promised she would never betray my confidence. I thanked her and changed the subject. The conversation continued for another hour. By the time we said goodbye in the parking lot, she appeared completely relaxed. Driving home, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and determination. Part of me still hoped I was wrong. Part of me wanted the rumor to go nowhere. But another part already knew what would happen next. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was trimming rose bushes in the backyard. The call came from Daniel. His voice sounded unusually cautious. After a few minutes of small talk, he asked whether I was really planning to donate family property outside the family. I nearly smiled. Not because the question surprised me, because it arrived exactly when I expected it. I calmly asked where he had heard such a thing. Daniel hesitated. Then he admitted that several relatives were discussing it. Some were worried. Others were confused. Apparently, the story had traveled quickly. After we ended the call, I set down my gardening shears and sat quietly on the patio. The spring breeze moved through the trees overhead. Birds chirped from somewhere beyond the fence. Everything around me felt peaceful. Yet inside my notebook, another piece of evidence had just fallen into place. The information could only have come from one source. Nobody else knew the story because nobody else had ever heard it. For months, I had been searching for certainty. That afternoon, certainty finally arrived. The test had worked. The question was no longer whether Olivia was sharing private information. The question now was what she hoped to gain by doing it. After Daniel's phone call, I stopped searching for proof. I had it. What I needed now was understanding. Proof tells you what happened. Understanding tells you why. Over the following week, I paid attention to something I had largely ignored before. Reactions. Not words. Reactions. People often reveal more through their responses than through anything they say directly. The next family gathering took place at my niece's house on a Saturday afternoon. The weather was perfect. Children ran through the backyard, chasing each other with water balloons while adults gathered around folding tables covered with food. It looked like every family event I had attended for the past 20 years. Olivia arrived carrying a homemade dessert and wearing the same warm smile she always wore. If I had not known what I knew, I would have thought nothing of it. I spent most of the afternoon quietly observing. Whenever discussions turned toward family finances, future plans, or property, Olivia became noticeably attentive. She never dominated conversations. In fact, she rarely spoke first. Instead, she listened. Then she added small comments that gently steered discussions in certain directions. It was subtle enough that most people never noticed. But once seen, it was impossible to ignore. At one point, my cousin mentioned retirement planning. Within minutes, the conversation shifted toward inheritance concerns and family expectations. Olivia barely said a dozen words during the exchange, yet somehow she influenced its entire direction. Driving home later that evening, I finally began seeing the larger picture. The rumors were never really about the information itself. The information was a tool. Each story created uncertainty. Each rumor weakened trust between relatives. Each private detail that became public encouraged people to seek clarification from someone else. And increasingly, that someone else seemed to be Olivia. The realization unsettled me more than any single rumor ever had. This was not about careless gossip. It was about influence. The following Monday, I met my attorney, Richard Bennett, for coffee. Richard had handled various legal matters for my husband and me for years. He was practical, discreet, and unlikely to be impressed by family drama. I did not tell him every detail. Instead, I explained that private information appeared to be circulating through the family and asked several questions regarding estate planning, privacy, and future documentation. Richard listened carefully. Then he offered simple advice. Keep records. Avoid emotional confrontations. Let facts speak for themselves. His words stayed with me long after the meeting ended. That evening, I returned home and reviewed my notebook from beginning to end. The entries now stretched across several months. Dates, conversations, phone calls, rumors, observations. What had once looked like isolated incidents now formed a clear timeline. For the first time, I could trace how information moved through the family. More importantly, I could see where it started. As I closed the notebook, a strange sense of calm settled over me. Not satisfaction. Certainly not happiness. Calm. The uncertainty was gone. In its place stood something far more useful. Clarity. Olivia still believed I knew nothing. Daniel remained unaware of what I had discovered. The rest of the family continued operating as they always had. But the balance had quietly changed. For months, I had been reacting to events after they happened. Now I understood the pattern. And once you understand the pattern, you can predict what comes next. Over the next several days, I made no sudden moves. That was important. People become cautious when they sense a change. Olivia needed to believe everything was exactly as it had always been. So I answered her messages. I attended family dinners. I smiled at the right moments and asked about the grandchildren. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Quietly, however, I was preparing. Richard's advice continued to echo in my mind. Let facts speak for themselves. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that confronting Olivia privately would accomplish very little. She would deny everything. The family would be forced to choose sides. The truth would become tangled in opinions and emotions. I wanted something stronger than that. I wanted clarity. One afternoon, I invited Olivia to my house for lunch. We sat in the sunroom overlooking the backyard garden. Bright yellow flowers were beginning to bloom along the fence line, and a gentle breeze drifted through the screened windows. The setting felt peaceful, familiar, safe. During lunch, I casually mentioned another piece of information. This one was carefully designed. According to my story, I had recently received an offer from a historical preservation group interested in acquiring a small parcel of land connected to my late husband's family history. I explained that the offer was substantial and that I was considering accepting it. Then I added a detail that made the story memorable. I claimed that if the sale happened, a large portion of the proceeds would be directed toward a scholarship fund bearing my husband's name. Olivia listened closely. She asked thoughtful questions. She even praised the idea and said my husband would have been honored. I thanked her and quietly reminded her that I had not yet discussed the matter with the rest of the family. She assured me she understood completely. 3 days later, the first phone call arrived. Then another. By the end of the week, 4 different relatives had contacted me. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. They had heard I was planning a major property transaction. They were curious, concerned, confused. Some had heard details that were remarkably close to the story I had invented. Others had heard even more elaborate versions. One relative claimed the property had already been sold. Another believed I was restructuring my entire estate plan. The rumors had grown larger with each retelling. I documented every conversation in my notebook. Dates, names, details. What fascinated me was how quickly the information traveled. What saddened me was that none of it surprised me anymore. A few days later, Emily stopped by unexpectedly. We sat on the porch with glasses of iced tea while the evening sun settled behind the mountains. During our conversation, she casually mentioned hearing relatives discuss the scholarship fund. She shook her head and laughed softly. Then she asked whether I had really decided to move so much money outside the family. I looked at her for a moment before answering. That was when I realized something important. The story had now spread far beyond its original circle. It was moving through the family exactly the way previous rumors had moved. The pattern was repeating itself with almost perfect consistency. As Emily drove away that evening, I remained on the porch long after dark. The notebook rested beside me. Months of observations filled its pages. What began as suspicion had become certainty. What began as isolated incidents had become a clear sequence of events. And for the first time, I understood that I was no longer collecting evidence. I was deciding what to do with it. 2 weeks later, I invited the family to my house for Sunday dinner. There was nothing unusual about the invitation. I had hosted family gatherings for years. The grandchildren arrived first, racing through the front door with their usual energy. Daniel and Olivia came shortly afterward carrying a bowl of salad and a bottle of sparkling cider. Everyone seemed relaxed, comfortable, completely unaware that the evening would be different from any gathering we had shared before. We ate dinner together around the same table where countless family celebrations had taken place over the years. Conversation flowed easily. People discussed work, school activities, vacation plans, and neighborhood news. I listened more than I spoke. Patience had brought me this far. There was no reason to rush now. After dessert, I stood and carried a small notebook from the living room to the dining table. The room gradually grew quiet. Several relatives looked curious. Daniel asked whether everything was all right. I smiled and assured him it was. Then I sat down and opened the notebook. For a moment, nobody spoke. I explained that over the past several months I had become aware that private family conversations were somehow spreading throughout the family. Faces around the table shifted slightly. Some looked surprised. Others appeared uncomfortable. Olivia remained perfectly calm, at least at first. I continued speaking in the same measured tone I had used all evening. There was no anger in my voice. No accusations. Only facts. I described the rumors that had circulated. the conversations that had somehow reached distant relatives, the private information that repeatedly became public. Then I explained the tests, the false story about donating land, the fictional scholarship fund, the conversations that had been shared with only one person. Slowly, I connected each event to the timeline recorded in my notebook. Nobody interrupted. The room had become completely silent. Daniel stared at me without speaking. Several relatives exchanged uncertain glances. Olivia's expression remained composed, but I noticed she was no longer reaching for her drink. She was no longer smiling. When I finished describing the final test, I closed the notebook and folded my hands in front of me. Then I asked a simple question. If information known to only one person repeatedly appeared throughout the family, what conclusion would any reasonable person reach? Nobody answered immediately. They did not need to. The answer was already sitting in the room. For several long seconds, the only sound came from the grandfather clock in the hallway. Finally, Daniel looked toward Olivia. His expression was not angry. It was confused, hurt, searching. Olivia attempted to explain. She said she had only shared information because she was concerned about family relationships. She insisted she never intended to create problems. Perhaps she believed that explanation. Perhaps she did not. At that point, it no longer mattered. Intentions could be debated forever. Patterns could not. I listened politely and thanked her for being honest. Then I said something I had spent weeks preparing to say. Trust is not destroyed by one mistake. It is destroyed when someone repeatedly treats another person's confidence as an opportunity. The room remained quiet. No one argued. No one raised their voice. The conversation eventually moved on, but the atmosphere had changed. The truth had settled over the family like a clear sky after a storm. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I stood alone on my porch and looked toward the mountains. The air felt cool and clean. For months, I had carried questions, doubts, uncertainty. Now those burdens were gone. I could not control what others chose to do. I could only decide what I would allow in my life moving forward. And as I stood there beneath the stars, I realized something important. The woman I trusted most had become my greatest lesson. But the lesson had not made me bitter. It had simply taught me the difference between being heard and being valued.